Okay, welcome everyone to the third session as part of our great hosts from Imperial College London at the Jameel Institute. And I'm joined today by Richard Hatchett, who's the CEO of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or SEPPI. Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, who's the WHO Regional Director for Africa, and Sir Professor Andrew Pollard, who's Professor of Pediatric Infection and Immunity at the University of Oxford and Director of the Oxford Vaccine Group. We have a very provocative session title, Partnerships and Equity in the Global Response to COVID, Success or Failure. And I would say it's success and failure. I hope that we won't be all in on one or the other, but obviously many really important issues to address. So let's turn to Richard first for some 5-minute intros, and then we'll get started with our conversation. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And first, let me thank Neil, the Jameel Institute, and Imperial for inviting me to join today. It's a real pleasure. Looking forward to the discussion. On the chance that there are viewers who don't know very much about SEPPI, we are a new organization. I'll just say a very quick word about SEPPI. We were established in 2017 after the Ebola epidemics in West Africa to promote the development of vaccines against emerging infectious diseases and to prepare for disease X. COVID was the first disease X that the world has encountered since SEPPI was established, and we have been engaged in the response, and I'll talk about our contributions to the response momentarily. But one thing I want to underscore is that in our mission statement, it says that we exist to develop vaccines and related countermeasures to emerging infectious diseases, and with sort of a double underscore, and to ensure access to those products for the populations that need them. So access is part of our mission statement. It is intertwined with everything that we do and how we conceptualize making the kinds of investments that we make to promote vaccine development. It's always with an eye towards access. During the response to COVID, we immediately started to make investments in vaccine development. Our first investments were actually, we actually made our first investments within 12 days of the viral sequences being released. We made important early investments with Moderna, also with AstraZeneca, and we now have helped build what we believe to be the largest global portfolio of vaccine candidates. We have supported 14 candidates. 12 of those are still moving. Several of them, including the Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccines, are being used globally. And a couple of the other candidates that we've supported, Novavax and Clover, have had successful phase 3 clinical trial results, and we hope will become available very shortly. Related to our development work, though, starting in February of 2020, we began to think about how can we ensure globally fair allocation of vaccines. And with Gavi in particular, and WHO, and now with UNICEF, we helped to conceptualize and establish, and now we're overseeing COVAX. I think we will certainly be talking a lot about COVAX, the successes that it represents, the challenges that it's encountered, and the disappointments that many people have had with the outcomes. I think it's, in asking a question about success or failure, I wouldn't describe partnerships or equity as success or failure. Man, I think you put it well. There have been both. I would say our experience has been revelatory, and it has revealed the ways in which the global preparedness and response architecture that we had at the beginning of the pandemic was wholly inadequate to a globally fair, efficient, or fast response. We have lots to talk about, but maybe I'll just pause there and look forward to the back and forth.
Thanks, Richard. Now let's go to Dr. Moeti. From your perspective, what have been high points and low points so far in terms of the partnerships put together to respond to this crisis?
Okay, thank you very much. First, I'd also like to thank the Jameel Institute very much for having invited me to join this really important, riveting, I would say, conversation or series of conversations about the pandemic and these aspects of it. I'd like to greet you, Madam Moderator, and also Dr. Hatchett, whom I know, and Professor Pollard, and everybody who's joined this this session, and just say that it has been an extraordinary experience for the world, and as was just said, it has shown that we simply weren't ready for a public health event of this scope, and which has affected every country in the world, and we are learning many lessons, some extremely positive and exciting, I would say, from the perspective of the African region, even of WHO, and some extremely sobering, which lead us to be clear that our analysis, our expectations, our risk reviewing in the future, our scenario building should be very different from what we have done as far as this pandemic is concerned. I mean, starting with what has gone well. Clearly, we've seen science deliver at an incredible speed some tools that really are having an impact on the pandemic. So that's the result of years of working together and really partnerships like SEPPI, investments by particularly high-income countries, and partnership with the private sector have really delivered some extremely important tools. I would say that's been one very exciting and very positive aspect of this pandemic. And then we've seen as well the partnerships that had been established around the idea of global solidarity, global equity, pooling resources, capacities, expertise, and efforts embodied by organizations like SEPPI, of course, and embodied by WHO. We're an organization that's supposed to gather all member states of the world to work together towards global health. And some of the platforms that have been established, like the ACT Accelerator, COVAX, and others. So we've seen those partnerships really emerge even further, work very intensely to look at ensuring that there is a global response that's up to the challenge. I do think we've had very sobering experiences and lessons around the idea of equity. And if I may just take a look back at my own career as somebody who worked in the public health system in Botswana at a time when my country had the highest prevalence of HIV, and I was at that time program manager for HIV. So this is really a deja vu experience in terms of the agonizing situation of lack of access to antiretroviral therapy by African countries. And when we've gone through successive outbreaks, the H1N1, the inequitable access to what was needed to address that epidemic in the world. So for us in WHO, of course, equity is a guiding principle, and it's a key goal of our work. It's not only in terms of it being a principle, but we've understood that if we're going to achieve global health, it's essential, and some of the places where you make the most progress is where the situation is most challenging, driven by inequities of different types. And we've seen the pandemic has illustrated quite dramatically that pre-existing inequity has been central to vulnerability and to severe illness and death. And it's forced sometimes quite uncomfortable considerations in the response. So who has been worst affected, even in wealthy countries? It's been ethnic minorities, it's been people who live a certain way, who work in certain occupations, and where equity could have been, if it had been addressed, would have been a contributor to reducing some of the outcomes. Of course, the most dramatic challenge, failure, has been around equity in access to the key items that have been needed to respond to the pandemic, really from the beginning. between low and upper income countries. If you look at access initially to testing kits, which have driven the underestimation, we think, partly of the situation in African countries, protective equipment, and now very dramatically, of course, vaccines. And what has been a very interesting observation is the mismatch between the aspirations at a global level for equity and the statements expressing this, and then the actual behavior by various entities, frankly, the governments in wealthy countries, certainly to some degree the pharmaceutical companies, which have driven the emergence and the hard work of platforms like the COVAX facility, where also we have to acknowledge perhaps the scenario building, the risk analysis might have prepared us better for the fact that at the end of the day, governments are driven to look after their own populations first, and some of the statements really have not matched up to enabling access to some of these key items equitably throughout the world. So for me, what's most interesting is what does that teach us? What does that teach us going forward to the next pandemic? What do we need to put in place? Certainly, there's this emerging strong drive in Africa for local manufacturing, finally gaining some level of independence or self-reliance for some key items, which is an excellent thing, I believe. It's clearly not going to resolve the gap now, but it's something that's been put in motion, which we hope will take root sustainably and expand beyond COVID-19. So I would say there's been some positives, and that emerging determination to work with partners, to work with global partners to achieve some degree of self-reliance is, in Africa, I believe, is a very good thing, and we will support that to the extent possible, and I'm very hopeful that it will take root on the continent. But I think we do have some very interesting questions to ask ourselves, lessons to have learned as we build towards the future in some of the discussions going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moeti. I think, that gap that you talk about between rhetoric and delivery is so deeply felt, I think, by everyone in the field. And when you look at the calls coming out from all the different corners of the international community and high-income country governments themselves, there's a remarkable degree of consensus on what has to happen. And I'm really interested in hearing what it is exactly, that would change the dynamic where we are today, who exactly needs to act. I feel that there's a lot of calling to each other to do things without much clear progress and accountability. So your ideas on that, we'll come back to you on that. Let me now turn to you, Dr. Pollard. Obviously, the way that AZ started up and was funded included a lot of technology transfer plans right from the beginning. Could you tell us a little bit about that? It seems to me to be a really big highlight. It showed an incredible foresight also from the UK government. But I'd like to hear from you what are your thoughts on sort of highlights and lowlights of the response so far?
Well, I think the first thing to say is a very positive story really during 2020, perhaps a tale of two halves, with the 2021 perhaps giving us a bit of a wake-up call. Going back to the 11th of January last year, the genetic code of the virus was sent all around the world. That's before any of us even knew that there was going to be a pandemic. There was that international collaboration and sharing. For our development program, the preclinical studies, the animal studies were conducted here in the UK, in the US and in Australia with fantastic international collaboration. And then as we moved towards the clinical trials, I had engagement with colleagues in Brazil, in South Africa, in Kenya, and also all across Asia, all of whom were prepared to drop everything and help in vaccine development to move the agenda forwards. And then, as you mentioned, the partnership with AstraZeneca really driven by the university's desire to have a not-for-profit development here at Oxford, but also I think really critical work done here to look at how to transfer technology to multiple partners, which could then be taken on board by AstraZeneca in their very expanded program to more than 20 different manufacturing sites around the world, which is a huge effort. The issue around intellectual property has been in the news a lot, but that's such, in many ways, although legally challenging, it's a minor challenge from a manufacturing perspective. It's the technology transfer and supporting the technical side of this, which is the critical component, and that's been a huge effort during 2020 with all of those collaborators internationally. So that, to me, was a really fantastic, positive international collaborative experience involving the North and the South, East and West. And as we move into this year, I think, as has been highlighted by Richard and Matshidiso, it is that the difficulty there was the ambition to have an equitable delivery of vaccines was actually much harder to realise in practice. The ambition, I think, when we look at it starkly, was to make sure that those who were healthcare workers, older adults and those with health conditions got vaccinated first. And those were the people who are most likely to die from COVID. And it's so distressing to think that by about May of this year, there were enough doses already in the world, amazing achievement, that would have prevented the majority of those deaths. And yet here we are in November, and just for the end of this year, there's expected to be another 300,000 deaths. So I don't think there's any question that we have failed in that initial task. Since June, another 1 million people died up until today. So we've definitely failed in that task. I think what is difficult is how do you unpick that and work out how that could be avoided in the future? How can we actually do better from today? And it does become more complicated. There's a lot more infections already that have happened around the world. Immunity is in a very different place. How to best target the doses we have today is something that's more complicated, because really it's the non-immune who are those we should target if we're going to have a big difference in the mortality of the rest of the year. And I'm not sure I know how to do that, because I don't think testing the whole world is going to be the answer. But it's the unvaccinated remain at risk wherever they are. And the only way you can have equity from now on is to find those individuals and make sure they're protected.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a big challenge, and it really depends on each country's own distribution strategy. It's not something that can be done from some big partnership in the sky, but each country's government and civil society need to make that happen. I mean, maybe I'll ask you, Richard, to reflect a little bit on what are we seeing at the country level in terms of throughput, as they call it, the transition from vaccines arriving in country to the doses delivered. Countries have different levels of efficiency in that process. What are we seeing in different settings?
Well, actually, Amanda, I think you've summarized it fairly. I mean, different countries have different. The term that we're using within COVAX is absorptive capacities. Concerns about absorptive capacities, particularly for vaccines that have more complicated cold chain requirements, was certainly a factor early on in some of the decision making about which doses COVAX was procuring. We've been able, working with partners, to address many of the logistical challenges, and now we are able to deliver most vaccines to most settings. But that doesn't mean that in some settings, moving vaccine to more remote areas isn't still a real challenge. And so that actually, I'll just take a moment to dwell on the R&D aspects of that, which is what SEPPI's worried about. It does speak to the fact that we do need vaccines that are, that have less stringent cold chain requirements, that can be moved easily, and certainly that are lower cost. And to highlight Andy's point about the AstraZeneca vaccine, I mean, that was a very desirable vaccine on all three of those characteristics. And AstraZeneca, working with Oxford, took a very enlightened approach to how they were going to distribute and share the technology and make that vaccine available globally. I will say, one of the important partners that AstraZeneca shared with was Serum Institute of India because of their massive productive capacity, and yet Serum Institute of India is situated in a very, very large country that experienced a terrible outbreak, and that country's leaders made the decisions that national leaders will make, and this isn't to unduly criticize them. Other national leaders made the same decisions. They have to take care of their own populations, and thus the vaccine couldn't be shared broadly. What we are seeing, coming back to your question, wasn't meaning to stray away from it, what we are seeing is that there is even among low-income countries, there is a vast difference between the ability of some countries to deliver vaccines to large segments of their population, even within the low-income spectrum, and certainly as you move up the income brackets, the capacity to deliver vaccines, and where there are established national vaccination programs for delivering usually pediatric vaccination programs, those have been able to adapt. But we have to keep a close eye on it because we are receiving, I believe COVAX is now receiving 11 different vaccines, and those vaccines have different operating characteristics, and they're coming in, particularly the doses that are being donated, coming in with different expiry dates. And so the allocation of those vaccines to countries based on the needs of the countries and the absorptive capacities of the countries is extraordinarily complex. I mean, a hugely complex undertaking. And when there are delays in vaccine delivery or countries don't follow through on their pledged commitments, it complicates things even further. So the logistical challenge of delivering all of these vaccines to all of the countries, given the individual context and circumstances within each country, has been by far the most complicated problem that I've ever dealt with in my career.
It is incredible to, as you say, 11 different vaccines via COVAX when countries' vaccination programs were dealing with sort of one for only for children, and this is just an order of magnitude more complex. Coming back to you, Matshidiso, this issue around, you did mention ARVs, and the time between when ARVs arrived in a high-income country, 1996, to the founding of the Global Fund and PEPFAR, that was 5 years. Okay, so we're definitely much slower as a global community this time. Sorry, we're faster this time than in the past in terms of, but it's still much slower than desired. I think coverage levels in sub-Saharan African countries around 9% now. Is that right? Less, 4%, 5%? You'll tell me. How do we think about that issue in terms of, everyone is, as you said, everyone is sort of recommending the same things, which are make donations effective, swap dose delivery dates in the contracts with manufacturers. The high-income countries have to do that. UK and US have done some for this remaining part of 2021, but not in large volumes. And then, can Serum Institute export more volume? How do you see those factors playing out over the next couple of months? How much additional coverage would that give you in sub-Saharan Africa? What other tools do we have to move this faster?
Yes, I think as Richard was saying, we need to realistically deal with the capacities that are there, and there are huge attempts to ramp them up quickly. And knowing at the same time, half the African countries are having to carry out polio vaccine campaigns synchronized at the same time. And this is actually going on now, and this is something that they can't stop. And they have to continue with the child vaccinations. They can't stop that. So I think that idea that you need to expand this capacity quickly, you need to deploy it kind of in linked to the supplies that are coming in, which is something that's very difficult to predict, to manage, to be aware of. and to the degree possible, especially for the lower capacity countries, simplify what they have to do. So when my staff put on a slide for me, the complexity of dealing with the 11 vaccines, our immunization team, it was really then trying to map, so what do you need for which one, and in what sort of country would it be most suitable? So it's working all of that out as the work is continuing to build the delivery capacity in countries that's going to be most complex. I think what's really needed is planning together with the countries, because I've been told sometimes by ministers, we get a call to say vaccines are landing tomorrow, having been waiting several weeks, hoping, praying that the vaccines would arrive. So, and sometimes these are donations, and the decision-making seems to be very delicate and complex, and there's, of course, concerns about communicating too early and setting up expectations you can't fulfill. But I do think that planning together, including around the expiry dates, and progressively really working, drilling down at the micro level, looking at who is being vaccinated and how. We've also seen that the capacity of countries to communicate with and reach the right type of people at the right time and have them come forward to be vaccinated has been a challenge in some countries. It's been hugely different. There are countries that have absorbed the vaccines as soon as they arrive. So countries like the Ghanas, the Namibias, and the others, so the smaller countries, the Mauritiuses, have been able to roll them out quickly. And there are others whose systems are really challenged, and where also there is, in some countries, particularly in some of the Central African countries, a fairly strong anti-vaccine group that has taken root, surprisingly, we found, because generally people do bring their children for vaccination in Africa. So I think it needs very close breakdown of the data, as clear communication as possible, and really addressing the issue of the expiry dates, because what we would like to avoid is a narrative now of, that your systems aren't up to speed, here are the vaccines, and you can't deploy them, and you are redistributing vaccines, which we've had to do from a number of countries because the expiry dates were relatively short. I mean, recognizing again the dilemma and challenges of different countries, but we also would like some consistency in line with the science for a collective objective. I understand countries want their children to go back to school. We would like to address the issue of waning immunity and booster shots. But we have health workers who still haven't been vaccinated in quite a few countries, elderly people with comorbidities, and a wave coming at the end of the year, we are certain, in some of the countries. So, yeah, I mean, I can't give you the figures, what we expect. Certainly, we are seeing the vaccines start to arrive in countries, and now we are having to work very hard with our partners, with the governments, on the capacity to mobilize people to be vaccinated and the delivery capacity based on the lessons from the past. And to be honest, this is unprecedented. Nothing like this has been attempted in terms of a vaccination campaign in the past in the countries.
Yeah, I think that's sort of hasn't sunk in everywhere. I mean, I was talking to some colleagues from Sao Paulo in Brazil, a very, very wealthy city, but they said, over the past year, they've added 8 hospitals to their health system, and they've doubled the number of health workers to be able to deliver vaccine and do testing. And I don't think yet we have foreseen that level of increased investment in some of the sub-Saharan African countries. Obviously, that might be too much. We could discuss that, and there's some standing mechanisms, but the demands are intense. They are unprecedented, and we probably need to reframe it a bit as a humanitarian emergency, even though it's in slow motion, as you say. And a wave is coming. We sort of wait till the wave comes, and then we enter into the panic mode again. Let's pivot to the question that you have raised earlier, return to Andrew, around technology transfer and the capacity of low and middle income countries to boost their own manufacturing capacity. What has your group learned about technology transfer? I'm sure it did not always go as smoothly as one would like. This was also an unprecedented increase in manufacturing capacity. What have you learned? What could be done better, then maybe you could also advise Richard on what SEPPI should be doing in terms of investments in the future on manufacturing capacity and technology transfer.
That is a great question. I'm not personally a manufacturing person, and of course, although we have our own manufacturing facility here, it's on a very small scale. I think it's important to say that making vaccines is complicated. These are very complex biological products. The process required to make a vaccine is much harder than for drugs. And we were just briefly talking about the HIV epidemic, and the technology transfer for those drugs, which are chemical products, is relatively straightforward in comparison to vaccine technology transfer. So I think there does need to be not just transfer, there needs to be pre-existing experience in manufacturing vaccines in order to do that. And the partnering that Oxford, and in fact more so AstraZeneca, has done has been with manufacturers who know how to manufacture biological products. And even then, there is a lot of time that's required in order to get manufacturing started, to scale up, and to have production of the yields that you can get with plenty of time to do that. And one of the difficulties here is that if we said today that we could open a new manufacturing site, it would still be 6 months to a year before you can have very high yields from that site with manufacturing some of these complex products. So it's not a matter of, if you transfer the technology today, that it suddenly means that you've got tens of millions more doses immediately. And I think that's one of the real challenges here, is that you have to have the pre-existing investment in manufacturing. And I think for Africa, this has been the biggest challenge, is that there are very few manufacturing sites and not an established production at a high number of products for humans. And so I think if that changes, which I think there is enormous momentum for that to happen, that really changes the agenda for the future. Because as Richard rightly said, the necessity of national governments to protect their population does to some extent get in the way of the ability to equitably distribute vaccines. And so you do need to have production locally, but it's more than just that sort of nationalism. There's also the issue of supply chains into manufacturing, which are very complicated in a pandemic. And we found that last year during lockdowns. How do you get, for the trials, thermometers when there are none available in the UK? It's very difficult to do that. So you have to have the supply chain well set up and work out how that's going to be successful in the context of a pandemic to move things rapidly on. I think there is one very interesting example, which is the Korean company SK, who produced the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they totally exported all of the product that they made, as far as I understand, and didn't use any locally. And that's because that was the agreement they came to, and they honoured that agreement. So it's not true to say that everyone sort of protects their internally with the use of vaccines. But I think we can't anticipate a future where governments aren't going to want to focus on their own population who have elected them. I think one other thing just to think about here, we've been in a relatively mild pandemic with less than 1% mortality. And even in that context, we've seen very considerable vaccine nationalism. But we are threatened by pathogens that might kill a third of people or a half of people. And there is no way that governments are going to share doses in that scenario. And so I think we really do have to think very differently about how we have sufficient production and also that ability to work out internationally how better to have public health policy that focuses on those who are at risk of dying.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect segue to Richard to ask you to reflect on sort of what is the role of SEPPI during this continuing pandemic in terms of facilitating technology transfer, supporting the development of manufacturing capacity, and then what do we need to set up for next time?
Yeah, no, I think Andy set the stage beautifully and described the challenges we are seeing. I will say Andy mentioned SK Bio as a manufacturer for AstraZeneca. That was one of the tech transfers that SEPPI actually funded, and we essentially provided what we called a forgivable loan, assuming that the AstraZeneca vaccine would be successful, and then that product would, could be purchased from there. The what we observed during the pandemic, Andy may know the exact number. I think it was 11 technology transfers that AstraZeneca undertook. It was an extraordinary number of transfers. Andy, is that the right number? Or
there's over 20 manufacturing sites.
Okay, so it's even higher than that, and even with some of our, and so we had partners like AZ that were quite willing to do this, actually to the point that the rate limiter was the number of trained personnel who there is a definite skill to doing tech transfer, and there's only a limited number of people that can do this, and it does take time, and it takes being on the ground, and it takes working out, as Andy said, problems to make sure that you fully and completely replicated the manufacturing. Novavax, a much smaller company than AstraZeneca, also undertook a number of, they were based in the US, and we were concerned about vaccine nationalism in the US, and we funded them to set up manufacturing or aspects of manufacturing in Spain and in the Czech Republic, in Korea as well, and Gavi and the Gates Foundation provided funding to support production in India, which is an extraordinary number of tech transfer efforts for essentially a very small company to undertake. So there were partners who were willing to do that to the full extent of their ability to share the technology, and so I don't think it is entirely fair. It's not fair to represent this as this is just an intellectual property issue, and if you take away intellectual property rights, it'll all be solved. Many companies were doing everything they possibly could to extend and expand manufacturing. I will say one observation that SEPPI has had and the partners that we worked with is that some of the mRNA technology, which is, I won't oversimplify it and say it's a chemical process, but it's closer to a chemical process than more traditional approaches to vaccine manufacturing, has been transferred relatively reliably. There's an expense associated with that, but that technology has scaled more reliably than the other technology types that we have invested in, where that experience has been much more variable. AZ has been, a success story, but there are several other groups that have had more difficulty, and it speaks to how difficult biological manufacturing is. Looking forward, SEPPI very much is aligned with the idea that the only way to ensure equity in the future, particularly if we face more severe threats, and I think Andy is right to point out, we have faced at best a moderate pandemic with COVID, and we have seen the disruption that even a moderate pandemic can cause. The only way to ensure equity in the future is to move beyond a world where vaccine manufacturing is concentrated in the US, Europe, India, and China, because those are huge population pools that will absorb a tremendous amount of vaccine, as they have, and will lead to this, emerging gap between the countries that have vaccine manufacturing and the countries that don't. And I think without having more equitably distributed manufacturing, we're not going to have more equitable outcomes. And I am very encouraged by the efforts under the African Union, for example, and other regional entities to stand up and to ensure that vaccine manufacturing is in place. Andy already spoke to the complexity of supply chains. There are additional complexities to standing up manufacturing. It's not just building a facility and even having the supply chains, but it's also the environment, making sure that you have a trained workforce, making sure that you have a conducive regulatory environment, the right culture around quality, and that all has to be kind of built up in parallel. And I think SEPPI, looking towards what we can do in the future, we don't have the resources to go and build bricks and mortar facilities, but a lot of the investment banks and international financing institutions are quite interested in doing that now. SEPPI can provide technical support both to the banks as they look at opportunities, and we can work with countries that are committed to developing such capacity, and we can work with them on training, and we can work with their regulators, to do capacity building in critical ancillary areas that will be required for these facilities to be sustainable. The last element that I think is going to be really, really important is, there is a risk of overbuilding and not having a model for sustainability, and that would be tragic. And we need to be very careful as we make choices over the next few years.
Thanks. And Richard, we have a question in the chat about sort of next generation vaccines. Could you just say a few words about that? What kinds of investments are being made?
Sure. Just very quickly, I mean, we have continued our R&D investment. We are viewing the vaccines that we have as wonderful response vaccines. They may not be the vaccines that we want or need to coexist with this virus for the long term. I think we want cheap vaccines. We want vaccines that can be easily administered. An oral vaccine would be great. A nasally administered vaccine that might produce mucosal immunity that reduced transmission would be very important. So I have often analogized to the first generation of polio vaccines. It was a Salk vaccine, and it was an injection, and it had challenges. And of course, it was an inactivated vaccine, and they had the Cutter incident. Several years later, the Sabin vaccine, an orally administered live attenuated vaccine, came along. Was a much better vaccine for the vast majority of our experience trying to eradicate polio. I think we need to develop both vaccines with better logistical capabilities, but also we want to develop vaccines that we are secure will be variant proof. The current set of vaccines is holding right now. It's not guaranteed that they'll hold forever. And ultimately, because coronaviruses will represent a continued threat for pandemics, and potentially for the kinds of pandemics that Andy described that are really scary, I think we are making investments also to develop broadly protective beta coronavirus vaccines that would protect against a number of coronaviruses, not just COVID.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to come back to you, Matshidiso, on the issue. The topic of this overall seminar is about data analytics, and that does require data sharing. Andy pointed out the incredible international collaboration on the sharing of genetic sequences that pre-existed this event, wasn't totally codified for coronaviruses, more codified for influenza. Can you reflect on the way forward in terms of the existing data sharing arrangements and the governance of that data sharing? What do you see as the challenges and opportunities ahead?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. I mean, for the moment, if we look at sort of data sharing, data submission by countries, we've seen the example of in the COVID pandemic that it's been quite a mixed picture, quite a challenge at sometimes. It's relatively few countries that have openly shared line listing of their data so that it was possible to get in detail and analyze what it is that's going on with the data. And in fact, if you look not only at the technical side, but at the interface with the political side, we've had 2 WHO representatives declared persona non grata and kicked out of countries, essentially around what's the data saying, where did you get that story, that's not true, and it all became very politically charged. But still, I mean, we see that there are possibilities technologically of data sharing that would enable very fast action, sharing of capacities in analyzing data, and in enabling countries themselves to use their own data and their partners to use the data to support them. So as WHO, we think that this is something that needs to be pursued and discussed with countries where there is a sense of trust. And I'm told very often by ministers of health that, we suddenly see a publication by somebody about data in our country, and there's been where did they get that? We didn't agree to that. So I think we need to work with the existing data platforms. There are institutions that are working on this in the region. WHO is playing a role, and of course those partners that have the capacity now for artificial intelligence. I think countries need to understand that this is to their benefit. This will enable them to be able to have their data with their own participation, clearly with a sense that they are not helplessly enabling others to gain access to and not being in control of their data, but the limitations of being in control and the benefits of data sharing for everyone. I think that's the direction in which we're going.
Yeah, and Andy, what would you like to see? I mean, there's, as you said, it flowed fairly well at the beginning of COVID-19, but it's not like the pandemic influenza mechanism that was in place. We haven't tested that under a situation of extreme crisis either, but do you see a pandemic treaty as the way ahead on some of these things, or are there these more workmanlike agreements that we can foresee in the future to share data?
Is your question referring to data specifically, or yeah, I mean, I think the systems for sharing data are actually not so bad, and if it's data around emerging threats, then there is the existing viral surveillance, which is built on influenza. That clearly needs expanding. There's very good reason after a pandemic to think about that. So if you mean data from the development programs, then I think definitely thinking further about how we can be more open through development to make sure that things are more joined up. I think both WHO and SEPPI have been involved in that in the way they've been driving things. But actually, when you look at the main WHO approved vaccines, the 7 of them, there's been very little similarity in the development programs of those, and even definitions of endpoints for disease in those trials. So we haven't done quite as well in that area of sharing. I think the advances in sharing of global information about the pandemic is just extraordinary. I mean, you can look up almost any number you want on the internet at the moment from trusted sources. The quality of the data that comes from countries clearly for many countries needs to be improved, and that's something which needs some focus on. I don't think we need new organisations to do that. I think we have the existing organisations. They need strengthening to make sure that happens. I just also wanted to very quickly pick up on a comment that Richard made, really thinking about future pandemics, and we've got some exciting new technologies in viral vectors and RNA vaccines, but we don't know that those are going to be appropriate for the next pandemic threat. And it's really important that SEPPI and other organisations continue to invest in the old technologies. And Richard mentioned the original polio vaccine, which is a killed virus. That's a great technology if you have nothing else. And we could very well have been in that situation this time. The inactivated vaccines that have been used and deployed in many countries will almost certainly have saved many tens of thousands of lives in this pandemic, because they could be made at scale and early. So I think one really important thing here is not to get excited about the new technologies and throw everything else away. We need to continue to understand better, particularly with viral families which might be a threat, how we might have better generic understanding about how to make vaccines for them, so that just as this time we can make vaccines quickly rather than spending years of R&D before we even knew how to start.
Yeah, I think that inter-pandemic research and development agenda is quite important. And I think, you're identifying a lot of different areas where we need reforms or improvement or expansions, from data standards and trialing standards to data sharing protocols, potentially to expanding capacity to do genomic surveillance in low and middle income countries. And to share that with manufacturers so that they can quickly develop vaccine. In the case of pandemic influenza, that's something that's quite important. There are some questions that are very specific in the question and answer that I'll put them to you. One is around the syringe shortage that was recently publicized from UNICEF. And sort of what are the alternatives to injection vaccine, and what about the disposal of billions of syringes and vials? Anything in place on that you're thinking about? Does anyone wish to answer those questions?
I mean, I've just started to say, I won't be able to answer about developing vaccines that don't need an injection, just to, I mean, harking back to where we were a few minutes ago about capacity to deliver, that it would be supremely ironic now, having worked so hard on getting the actual vaccines into countries, to have to confront a shortage of the means of delivering these shots into people's arms. So that I think it speaks to the entire scope of building the capacity to manufacture. The demand for that to happen relatively quickly has been huge, and naively and acknowledging my own ignorance, I was asking my colleagues, so we seem to be focused on a particular type of syringe for a specific vaccine. So can we afford to waste some vaccine supplies for the sake of using less specific syringes, so that we can just expand the capacity to deliver vaccines? I'm certain this is being considered by the colleagues that are working on the logistics for this, but clearly it's a big concern at the moment.
Richard.
Yeah, I don't know the specific issue with the shortage of syringes, and it would be important to know that to understand how to solve the problem. We know, is it a shortage of raw materials? Is it something to do with the supply chain being blocked somewhere? And I don't think I can really comment on it. You definitely need syringes with the currently available vaccines that we have. Other development to look at other routes of administration could be very helpful here in the future, but we're not at a point today where we can make a difference in the pandemic with those.
I'll just say I would view the issue with syringes as the current instantiation of the supply chain issues, and what we have seen at multiple points along the way with multiple vaccine manufacturers are challenges getting some critical component, or either an input to the manufacturing, or medical glass, or in this case syringes, that becomes a bottleneck, and it becomes a rate limiter for the delivery of vaccine. And that, one of the things that we've done is to set up something called the COVAX marketplace, where we try to match upstream suppliers with vaccine manufacturers who have identified needs. There's also interdependencies and complexities and unintended consequences, as many countries have begun to complete their mass vaccination programs and are moving towards a more sort of steady supply of vaccine. It's desirable to move, for example, from delivering vaccine in 20-dose vials down to single-dose vials, but that puts an incredible strain on the global glass supply and on global filling capacity. And so these individual decisions, which all seem rational and well-founded in a local context, aggregated, have tremendous global impact and could impact our ability to deliver vaccine to regions like countries in Africa, where they're still in the midst of trying to initiate their mass vaccination. Yeah,
it's quite complex, and it's not like there's someone in charge of the market, as you say. Each country making its own decisions, and are our international institutions really funded sufficiently to be a player in this? I think SEPPI's played an important role in identifying shortages before, reserving some of those supplies, especially for manufacturers that are serving COVAX. So we'll continue to watch that and hope that governments will match some of the rhetoric with action in terms of the support to international agencies like SEPPI. Dr. Moeti, there's a question for you in the question and answer. There are clinical community-led data collection and global collation efforts such as ISARIC, and efforts by one of my favorite acronyms in global health land, GLOPID-R, which is a network of funders of research and development activities that are non-vaccine, so medicines. And they have had a lot of engagement from partner countries. And the biggest contributor is South Africa. So I guess a question to you is, how do you see low middle income countries engaging more effectively in some of these international networking efforts to solve the supply chain bottlenecks? Do you feel like the COVAX experience was sufficient? Would you have designed it differently going forward? Any thoughts on that?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, really about being inclusive in the design and in the implementation of some of these initiatives, so that some existing potential is brought forward, is mobilized to be engaged in some of this work. I mean, I think the observation is that there's a lot of room to do better there. From the very initiation of these some of these activities, to be clear that, I mean, very often we see at the global level a very skewed representation and engagement between the North and the South. How to bridge those gaps in an intentional way, I think, is something that we need to incorporate in a very conscious way in what we do, then that to mobilize and engage better some of the existing capacities and create the momentum to develop them further in countries. That's what I'd like to say.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you 1 minute to reflect on what we've talked about and what you see as sort of a key agenda going forward, what you'd like to see. We'll start with you, Andy.
Well, I think there's much to be optimistic about in the pandemic. We today over 7 billion doses have been distributed. Who would ever have thought that we'd be at this point when we were discussing last year in the Northern Hemisphere spring that there would be years before there'd be any vaccines. So I think there's an extraordinary progress been made, but it does today very much highlight the inequity, and I think we have to work out how we change that position we're in today, where only 3.7% of people in low-income countries are vaccinated, and overall we're at around about 50% of the population. So I think that really is something which we have to focus on for the future. What are the solutions to make sure that that we can manage the equity arguments further on? We definitely need to intensely now be investing in understanding the biology of the threats that we face for the future, and working out the systems that we will need in place at some point in humanity's future to defend us from an even more lethal pandemic.
Absolutely. Okay, Matshidiso, final minute.
Yes, thanks. I mean, I also think that overall there's been a very positive global drive to overcome a very challenging situation. I mean, from the African perspective, I believe we need a very clear short-term plan. I do not believe the imbalance between what we say and what we do is acceptable. I think we need to look for every opportunity to continue to cover this gap, even as we acknowledge that other countries need to deal with the complexity of, expanding needs. We just have not dealt with the very essential needs in African countries. We should do that. And I'm very pleased as well that we're looking at the longer term, including some of the issues that Richard brought up, sustainability of some of these investments, building on this excitement at the moment. And I hope very much that we can do both, and just to assure that in WHO we're very determined to support our countries in their engagement on this.
Well, thank you so much for your leadership during this time. Richard?
I just a couple of things. I mean, I think there are silver linings to our experience with the pandemic. I mean, we've seen advances in technology, we've seen innovations in clinical trial design and regulation. We have new concepts of preparedness. Andrew was talking about, preparing for viral families. We've seen the important emergence of regional mutual security efforts. I think the African Union has really led the way in that regard, and we've got a moment of political opportunity. We've also had a incredible set of experiences with the pandemic that, as I said in my opening comments, have been revelatory of all the ways in which the system was not designed to succeed. And so if we take advantage of those opportunities that are emerging from the pandemic, and we look objectively at what created the outcomes that we've got, which are unacceptable, I think we have an opportunity to prepare the world for much better preparedness for future threats.
Very good. Well, this has been a really great conversation and a clear way forward. So I'll conclude and thank you, Neil and Jameel Institute, for hosting us here.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank all of you for that stimulating discussion. I think there's my schedule in front of me. I could talk for 25 minutes about the last sessions. I won't spend so long, but it has been a fascinating collection of sessions we've had, spanning everything from communications, the role of scientists, politicians, the media, in terms of providing clear communication in a crisis like a pandemic, and the kind of fine balancing act between encouraging and stimulating active debate about something which affects everybody's lives and the risk of misinformation. And one interesting theme which was highlighted in that first session is the fact that despite our concern about social media echo chambers and the risk of misinformation, the pandemic has seen populations across the world go back to trusted sources of authority in the traditional media. Also, very interesting debate about different models of communicating scientific consensus between different countries. And then in the second session, ably facilitated by Nick Robinson from the BBC, we compared three very different countries, South Africa, Sweden and the UK, and the role of government scientists in those countries. The panelists were people employed by the government in each country, and as intermediaries between the broader scientific community and the public, indeed, and between politicians. And again, remarkable given the differences in details of policies implemented, but a remarkable degree of consistency about the importance of trust, both between scientific advisors and their political masters, but also between governments and the population at large, in order to get buy-in, and the importance of community cohesion. And then finally, in the last session, just heard about both the successes, and I wouldn't call them failures, but shortcomings of the global response against the pandemic. And we're all aware of the level of inequity in terms of access to vital countermeasures, most notably vaccines, particularly in the lowest income countries of the world. But again, that session was optimistic looking forward, recognizing that things, as Richard Hatchett said, the pandemic has highlighted the things which need to change. It's also highlighted the things which have worked very well in terms of the global coalitions formed to develop vaccines at speed. But I think the key conclusion there is that for preparing for the next pandemic, which, as Andy Pollard said, could be even more lethal than COVID-19, the only way to really prepare the world is to ensure we have local manufacturing capacity and the supply chains and the health systems to deliver countermeasures in a crisis in an equitable, at least a more equitable way than we've seen this time. So I thank the audience for listening. It's been a real pleasure being an audience member myself, listening to these very stimulating discussions, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Thank you again.